You are listening to wuvt-fm 90.7 Blacksburg. My name is Oliver Rose from the WUVT News staff, and I have with me here Joy Powers,
the longtime Bedford County cattle farmer, public servant, and challenger to U.S. Congressman Morgan Griffith in this year's election for Virginia's 9th Congressional District. Good afternoon, Ms. Powers. It's great to have you here.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here today.
How are you doing today?
It's been a great day. It's a great sunny day in Blacksburg, and I'm excited to be here and talk about rural Virginia and what we have planned.
All right, then. So to get started, who are you, what motivated your voyage into public service, and what experience can you provide to this end?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start off by saying I am not a politician, and so I am a policy nerd. So I have always loved policy, and I think what kind of sets me apart was I grew up at a bipartisan kitchen table. So I grew up with a conservative mom that's never voted for Trump, and I grew up with a Jimmy Carter Democrat-style dad. And so when you have those two things and you start talking about issues like our family farm and our farm equipment dealership that we've had since 1961, you don't really get to blame one party or another for failures. You just get to see bad policy for bad policy and good policy for good policy. And so I've always loved that. At the same time, I've always been a Democrat. And, I joke and tell people that you guys you might be too young for this, but in our third grade mock presidential elections, how in elementary school everybody does your cast your vote. I was the one third grader in my class that voted for Al Gore. So, I've always been that blue dot Democrat in Bedford.
Oh, yeah, no, my parents are also politically split, so I understand the same thing. The issues become much less binary. There's no room for just, why are we all yelling at each other, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, it was shocking to me, I think, as I grew up and realized exactly how polarizing politics were in some families and in some communities. And so that's something that we're definitely trying to fight with this campaign.
All right, so luckily for you, you have a lot of time to be a policy nerd in this hour. We're going to get over your campaign now. Your campaign is largely centered upon local economics, abiding to 4 grand tenets, spelling out the acronym HOME: healthcare, opportunity, market affordability, and education. I suppose we may start going right down the list. Rural healthcare can be a bit of a sore topic in Virginia sometimes, as many rural Virginians navigating the healthcare system as we speak know so well. Rural hospitals now shut their doors left and right, including most recently 3 in the Shenandoah Valley just this past September, and potentially 4 more in the 9th District. One of your largest grievances about Medicare and Medicaid as they stand is how they do not consider how population density, travel time, and local provider scarcity is part of the reimbursement calculations, often forcing rural hospitals to operate on razor-thin margins. What policies would you like to see enacted or retained that would protect rural hospital access?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that healthcare is a great place to start when we're talking about policy, especially in the 9th District, because, healthcare is sacred. That's something that, when we talk about being the best country in the world, if we can't provide adequate or even just any health care to all of our people, then we're failing. And so we know right now that we're failing to provide health care in America. What I want to say to Congressman Griffith, as chairman of the Subcommittee of Health, what have you done about it? You're part of the problem instead of part of the solution. And so you highlighted, a lot of what we really care about is correcting what policy on paper doesn't see, and that's that there are holes and gaps that are costing lives in rural communities. That's what people don't understand is a drive time to a hospital. That's whether somebody makes it or not. That's, whether your dad gets there or doesn't. At the same time, we're sitting in Blacksburg right now. Although Blacksburg is not part of the 9th anymore, Blacksburg, under Morgan Griffith, Blacksburg PD had to start training your police officers to start delivering babies on the side of the road because we don't even have an OB center here in Blacksburg. And this is one of the population centers of Southwest Virginia. And so when you think about your OB care down in places like the coal fields or, down even, we just had a state delegate, have a healthy baby, thank God, and we're glad that family has a healthy baby. But we had a state delegate here in the 9th whose wife had to cross state lines to have a baby. She went to a hospital in Southwest Virginia because she needed to deliver a baby, and instead of being able to receive care there, she had to cross state lines into North Carolina. The fact that we can't even deliver babies in our own district, it's inexcusable. And so, some of the things that we want to do is we want to incentivize providers to be able to come here. And so right now, a lot of people don't know that Congress actually controls and funds all the medical residencies across America. And so we can go through, and we don't have to create a whole new system. We can create incentives within that existing system to bring more doctors here. And we know it works because there's organizations like the Appalachian Highland Dental Center who's already using that exact same model. And we're getting providers from Harvard, from, all over, from UNC, that want to come and work in Southwest Virginia. So it's not a question of do they want to come. It's we're not providing the infrastructure to get them here. And it's costing our people lives.
I do know I saw something a little earlier, maybe late in 2025, talking about Spanberger visiting a hospital in Big Stone Gap, and they talked about if the hospital were to close, then people would have to commute all the way over to the Lonesome Pine Hospital, and that was something like a 40 to 45 minute commute. And like you were saying, yeah, that could be, if it were a life-threatening emergency, the difference between life and death.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're hearing that all throughout the district is, the hospitals that are there, they're struggling to provide care. But, I sat down with one of our hospital presidents in the district who looked me in the eye and said, Joy, I walked Morgan Griffith through the impacts of the big, beautiful bill to our healthcare system in the district. He knew before he voted yes exactly what was going to happen to our hospitals. He knows what's going to happen next year because we've seen some reimbursement cuts, but the most cuts to our healthcare system, they're coming next year. That's when it's really going to hit families next year. And so when you think about that and you think about what he signed our families up for, he shouldn't get the privilege of representing us anymore.
That might be when the nail in the coffin happens for those 4 hospitals in the 9th District that people had been talking about earlier.
Absolutely.
Coal miner health is a huge problem in Southwest Virginia. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health has recently detected an increase in mortality rates from black lung disease, especially among younger miners, likely due to the higher silica content of coal. Mm-hmm. The issue is, of course, compounded by inadequate local hospital access and threats to Medicaid. What would you do to support the long-term health of coal miners?
Yeah, so black lung is something that we have taken very seriously, and we have to in this district, because what we're seeing men and miners being diagnosed younger and younger. So we're seeing 38, 40-year-olds getting diagnosed. The other issue that we're seeing is we're also seeing intimidation tactics by the coal corporations. And so a lot of these miners are so afraid to get tested that they'll lose their jobs. And so, not only has, Donald Trump and Morgan Griffith come in and they claim to be champions of coal, and I want to make sure that we differentiate that they are champions for coal corporations. They are champions for coal companies. They are championing for deregulating the protections for miners. And that is why we've seen that increase of miners, is we've seen intentional efforts to lower safety standards in those mines. We absolutely cannot have that, and we cannot have that continue. Furthermore, I think that we also have to point out that, Congressman Griffith, he was the sole congressman, bipartisan in all of coal country, to vote against the miners' health care and pension. And that right there should be enough. That should be enough. He got this seat, by being supposedly a champion of miners. I think he should lose it based on the way he's treated miners since he's had it.
So essentially you consider him a champion for the value accrued from coal mining, but not necessarily any value that is getting to miners themselves.
Absolutely. And we're hearing that directly from miners, and so we recently sat down with Senator Warner for a great roundtable with some black lung some minors who have black lung, some black lung widows who lost their husbands to black lung, and some doctors, lawyers, providers. And, simple things like black lung currently isn't even listed in the disability handbook. So these men who are being diagnosed at 38 or 40 years old, it's not even in the disability handbook. Senator Warner came down, and because he came down and sat with minors and dug into that and looked for an answer, he found that and he's working on it. That should have been what Congressman Griffith has done years ago, but it's not, because he doesn't want to draw any attention to the black lung epidemic that is caused by his deregulation.
And opioid abuse and accordingly high overdose rates are just some of the many consequences of chronic mining-related pain such as black lung left untreated. You've expressed a desire to frame drug addiction as a medical issue, not a criminal one. What steps will you take to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've seen a lot of opioid abatement money and funding come in from lawsuits from pharmaceutical companies into Southwest Virginia. I would like to see that be invested a little more directly into the communities that are most impacted. And so, for example, this past December we were down in Pennington Gap, and there was a group of about 17 individuals who were going through some on the road of using and some in early recovery, but are struggling, with opioid addiction. And the issue is there's nowhere there for them to go for help, but there's also nowhere for them to go because, they were unhoused, living under a bridge in 15-degree weather. The churches, even in the community, are concerned about opening the doors because of the active addiction. We can't shy away from understanding that, we label people as addicts, I think, so we don't have to look at them as people. And that's what has to be corrected. We have to say that we systemically failed these communities, which led to systemic addiction. And until we, actually address that and can be able to see that just because somebody might have faced and struggled with addiction, in Southwest Virginia, it doesn't mean that they don't deserve equal dignity in that community. And so I think that, investing in direct efforts there's a great project in Marion where they turned it was on the demolition list. It was an old TB unit back from the 20s, and it was it looked like it belonged on the demolition list, right? Just knee deep in debris and junk.
Yep.
But what happened was that community got a community needs assessment, and they found out that their newborn addicted rate was almost triple what all other communities in the state were. And so instead of looking at that and saying, what are we going to do and just blaming someone else, they instead took this building that was on the demo list. They got $6 million in historical tax credits. They went through, and now I was honored to attend the ribbon cutting. It is a state-of-the-art rehab facility, residential facility for men in Marion County, and I think that or in Marion and Smith County, and I think that's huge. But what's also huge is that project only happened because Senator Warner and Senator Kaine made it happen. Congressman Griffith wouldn't even write the letter of support for the project. And so that's where I think him and I differ is, most of his money comes from corporate PACs. He takes a lot of money from pharmaceutical companies. I don't do that, but instead my focus is on how can we actually use the federal government and use the federal tax dollars that we've already paid. That's the thing, is we've already paid these taxes in. But if our congressman isn't adequately using these programs to invest that back into this district, we're settling for scraps what we could have.
Well, it is great that rehab facility ended up being built, and it would be really cool to see some more facilities similar to that or other programs that could actually target the community struggling the most.
Absolutely.
So, we all know Southwest Virginia is the coolest region of Virginia, hands down. But of course, one of the greatest laments about the region is that just like so much of rural America, it has been relegated a little more than a resource extraction zone on a national economic scale, and its communities and infrastructures have been disinvested from largely in favor of urban coastal service economies. One of your most ambitious policy goals, and one that I have been quite interested in myself, is to actually build back up a local, self-sufficient southwestern Virginian economy from scratch. The question is, how does that begin? What first steps would you take such that this region can build prosperity by its own agency for generations rather than being subservient to faraway corporations?
Yeah, absolutely. I have to give credit where credit's due, and there's a project in the works right now that I'm really excited about. And that is our inland port project in Southwest Virginia. And so I obviously cannot take credit for that, but there's a lot of folks and that have been working on that for years at the state level, and I know Governor Spanberger is intent on seeing that through. But basically, the plan is to build an inland port by rail through and to Washington County. And what that would do is immediately relieve some of the pressure at the port. So, you'll see containers come in, they'll immediately get, on rail and shipped out and then sorted. And we'll be able to have more distribution in Southwest Virginia. To me, what I would like to see happen, if we know the inland port's coming, how can we revitalize and reuse the infrastructure that we already have? I think it's brilliant that we lean back into rails. We know that the railway is what built Southwest Virginia, it's what built America. And so right now in Buchanan County, they're taking up railways. And so exactly. And so instead of, taking that infrastructure up in a county that really barely has a 4-lane highway, why aren't we leaning in to see how we can actually connect our manufacturers? That's what I want to see is more incentive in how we can actually get the existing manufacturers we have to expand jobs. I think too often we try to start from scratch and we end up bringing in large corporations from other countries and other parts of the country into our district, when I'd like to see a lot of that be revitalized. So think about it. If we have a medical part manufacturer here in Southwest Virginia, and we have many, if we can help them and get them to where they can use and revitalize that railway and be connected to that inland port, it's going to immediately open up new markets for them.
Full disclosure, I'm a little biased here, but I would love to see rail make a comeback in rural regions, especially including a commuter rail. That could be pretty cool. They are coming close. Amtrak is to finally extending its Northeast region line over from Roanoke to Christiansburg, and I know it is not really part of the district anymore, but it means that Virginia Tech students are going to be able to have a much wider range of options to get from place to place, and it would be even cooler if some further out small towns more into Southwest Virginia got the same opportunity.
Absolutely. And there's actually some folks I know, like the Bristol Chamber of Commerce and in the Washington County, some folks down there, they're actually working to do that. And so they actually want to bring Amtrak and bring that all the way back down into Bristol, which would actually put a through line down through Southwest Virginia. And I think that's incredible because, like you said kind of a few minutes ago, I do believe that this region is I think it's the most beautiful region of the state, but it's a little bit harder to get to, so a lot of people don't see that, but I think Abington is maybe one of Virginia's best kept secrets. We have the Creeper Trail, but we also have Breaks Interstate Park.
I just went to Abington a few weeks ago for the first time. It was gorgeous.
It is.
We stayed at a cool hotel there.
Yeah. It's an awesome. It's we have so much in the district, and there's so much, I think, rich culture still here, and we still have that Appalachia culture that people still love. And so, how can we use tourism and industry in a way that's respectful and dignified and for that?
Yeah, and this inland port you were talking about, just so I am sure, it is in Bristol. Would that be on the Clinch River or someplace else?
So they're actually going to bring it in by rail, and it's going to be in Washington County. So you're going to see containers get off water, off ship, and then immediately be put on rail to then have kind of a processing center within Southwest Virginia. And so ideally, that being right near two interstates is going to be, I think, the draw there. So the key would be to get it, I think, from the port to to Washington County and vice versa.
Tell me more about your plan to reclaim disused mining land. What skills would this entail, and what would the output be?
Yeah, so, I think that we've seen some interesting progress with reclamation projects in the coal fields. And first, I want to say that I really do believe that the answers from Southwest Virginia come from Southwest Virginia. And so it's really important for me that the coal communities have a seat at the table in how we revitalize those mine lands. And so in having those conversations, and seeing what we have, we've learned that, under Obama and even the Biden administration, we had coal reclamation projects. And so we have in Southwest Virginia what's called gob piles. And so back in, decades and decades ago, when they were mining by hand, a lot of coal that wasn't the right size was just literally just tossed in a hauler. And now we have these piles, and they're not little piles, but think, building size piles of this coal. And there's two avenues of thought. One, if you go in and mess with it the wrong way, that creates an environmental hazard. If you leave it there, you're also creating an unknown environmental hazard. And so, under the Obama administration, they had the clean coal plant built there, Virginia City. They went through and they did some reclamation projects with those mining, and that actually put jobs back in coal country. And we were down in Dayton, which is, really the thick of coal country and used to be before the companies left town. And we were talking to Bobby there at the museum, and Bobby's really sweet. She's lived within sight of the museum in Dayton her whole life, and she's been there a while. And she was telling us about how proud they were when those reclamation projects came, because, in the museum, they did drug testing and they had all the screening for the jobs, but it provided really dignified, well-paying local jobs. Still with coal, still in coal country. However, Trump came through and immediately cut all those projects, just blanket. And so that was really unfortunate. I'd love to see us, go back to that. But specifically on the mine lands, what I think that, it should be up to those communities. We've seen some projects that were done well and done with foresight. They actually have put housing and recreation resources on that. Others, where they weren't done correctly, they become overgrown with invasive species and just kind of, wastelands. So I think that there is proper ways to do that. Now, what I will say is I don't appreciate hearing Northern Virginia Democrats come and suggest that that's where they're going to put their next data centers without ever visiting our communities and without ever talking to our communities. We're not going to do that regardless of what party you're from. So
that would be very nice not to have data centers. Resource extraction is not the only primary industry Southwest Virginia has historically relied on. You also expressed a great desire to not only support small farmers and prevent industry consolidation, but also generate local food networks, prevent food deserts, and ensure, as you said yourself, that Appalachian food stays in Appalachia. Mm-hmm. Seeing as you have boots on the ground experience in this department yourself, I would like to hear how you would organize Southwest Virginia's agricultural system to make this a reality.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that, I say I'm a fourth generation cattle farmer. My people have been farming forever. I don't know what we were farming commercially before that, but we've been farming cattle commercially for 4 years, and we're in the farm equipment dealership. And I will say that, for a long time, I made the statement that we had, I was very proud to be a farmer in America because we had the safest and most affordable food in the world. Unfortunately, I think that we're venturing farther away from that. And I think that what we have to, when we talk about food security, there's a few things that need to happen. Is we have to have more food processing. We have to have more grocery stores. I think that, when you take just Southwest Virginia, for example, I have sat in meetings with we were down at a senior club meeting, and there was these two elderly ladies, and they were planning their grocery trips, and they were having to schedule which week they bought bacon, because the same pack of bacon at their local food city was $2 more than it was at the food city that had a competitor in town. So they had a list of things that when they went farther into town they would buy because the price wasn't jacked up on them when they went to the doctor. Our elderly should not be having to live like that. And so, we've seen that this is now, we're seeing it getting worse with dynamic pricing and AI and things like that being introduced into our grocery stores and things. And so, I think that first and foremost, there's some policy and legislation that we do need to step in and federally, protect our consumers. And then we need to protect our farmers. And so, the biggest thing that I have to say is we are not enforcing anti-monopoly laws in the meat market. Point blank, period. Joe Biden, he opened up an investigation into those markets. When Trump was inaugurated, he canceled it. And that's important because JBS, who's a foreign-owned, one of the major four meat packers, was the largest contributor to his inauguration fund. And so, when you think about that kind of association, and when you hear him do things like open up our beef market and, bring in Brazilian and Argentinian beef and flirt with opening up the Mexico beef border every other day, those type of things really do matter. But, right now, of course, the Department of Justice has said that they're investigating. I want to see action. It's kind of like we still don't have mandatory country of origin labeling. And so, we legally are not allowed to put on a product that it was raised and processed and marketed in America.
What could Congress do to prevent monopolies?
Yeah, so we definitely want to see, more investigation, and we want to see the Department of Justice actually, complete a full investigation. But Congress needs to actually go back through and look at those anti-monopoly laws again, close the loopholes that are existing, because, what's happened is they found, 40 years ago, you had 50 companies that controlled 80% of meat processing in America. Now you have 4 companies that control 85% of meat processing. So a few years ago, what ended up happening was they actually were caught price fixing. So they were caught colluding with each other to make sure they could get as much money as they could from you and I, the consumer. There was an investigation. They were fined. They were fined significantly, and I mean a fraction less of what they made off the scheme.
So it was like pocket change.
Exactly. So until we're actually going to punish these companies to the degree of which they're profiting, why wouldn't they continue to scheme against the American consumer?
Yeah. And meanwhile, you would also support legislation that would ban AI not price gouging, but dynamic pricing.
Absolutely. And so, I think that when I talk to people and I talk to folks about dynamic pricing, a lot of people don't understand. I asked them, I said, have you noticed your grocery stores, they're starting to add digital tags? I'm not that old, I'm 34, but I remember that it used to be almost, you couldn't go through the grocery store without seeing, it's usually a high school kid and their entry-level employee changing manually the prices on things. Now, we have executives being able to change the prices on your groceries with the push of a button. And they're talking about doing it in a sense of, well, let's raise the prices at 5 o'clock because we know the crowd that's getting off work, if they're income earners, likely could pay more. And so they're going to charge you more.
Or it could be like you have a really, really hot July day and suddenly the price of a bottle of water is $8.
Exactly. Or, an emergency, Lord forbid. And so all of those types of things, I think that, what we're seeing is, I say that what the American economy and what the MAGA economy is trying to do essentially to all of America is what happened to coal country decades ago. They're trying to turn everything into a company town essentially, and they're going to make sure, I think that the intention is to kill the possibility of generational wealth. The American dream is becoming just that. It's becoming a dream. It's not a tangible reality for young people anymore.
Like George Carlin said, you gotta be asleep to believe it.
Right.
Yeah. And I was gonna say something, but we were talking about you lack a generation. Right. You said they want to make America one big company town essentially. I've never heard it that way, but this is an interesting way to think about it. Numerous Virginian politicians, including new Governor Abigail Spanberger, as well as local delegate for Virginia's 41st State House District over here, Lily Franklin, whom we actually interviewed just a few months ago, have demonstrable success with making affordability the core tenet of their campaigns. What are some of the ways you will keep electricity and housing costs low for so many Virginians who just barely have their heads above water?
Yeah, absolutely. So Lily's a good friend of mine, and her and I have worked on with Clean Virginia a lot about trying to get energy more affordable. I think that, last year when I decided to run for Congress, we knew affordability was going to be important. Obviously, Governor Spanberger won and won big on affordability. But what's actually happened since was it's become more of a crisis. Life is becoming more unaffordable by the day. I'll never forget, we were down in Clinchco, which is a little coal town, and when a little old lady, when she really wants you to hear something, she like grabs both of your hands and looks you directly in the eye. She clasped your hands, and she clasped my hands, and she looked at me and she said, "I just need you to know that our energy bill was $1,100, and our income is $1,400
in 1 month."
In 1 month. And so, when you think about, I think 80% of our homes in this district are over 40 years old. So when you think about that in terms of insulation and energy efficiency and things like that, it kind of makes sense, And I turned around and I was just shocked, and I was talking to a deputy who was working there in Russell County, and we were talking, and he said, I think every other house in this community is probably choosing between heating and eating this winter. And I think that's the reality that maybe our politicians have become so saturated in Washington that they don't actually feel and hear that our people can't afford to eat. And so, key affordability bills is we have to get the burden of data centers and their infrastructure off the back of taxpayers. We have to make that to where if you want, you got to pay to play. And right now, I'm not in the Virginia legislature, but I take every opportunity. I say, while Virginia Democrats have power and universal power here, we need to pass campaign finance reform. That's how we make Virginia more affordable. We need to start there. That's gonna make everybody kind of clean up their act a little bit across the board. And I know Delegate Franklin and I are both very passionate about that. But we also, when we talk about things like, making sure that we're not putting protecting consumers from dynamic pricing and things like that, that's also important. But really, we need and we can't undersell the impact that the outrageous spending that is going on in Washington is having to our local taxpayers. We're getting killed here at home, with our bills and in the grocery store. But the issue of of what we're investing in as a country, it's not making it any better. And I'd say in fact, it's making it worse. If you just take this war in Iran, as a farmer, I know what that did to fertilizer prices. I know what it did to fuel prices in a time where we're supposed to be, planting and putting fertilizer down and things like that. That's not really going to hit consumers till this fall. And so, I really want folks to think about how bad grocery prices are now. These guys in Washington, they're not even acknowledging the problem, much less trying to fix it.
Well, prices are not impacting them, so the prices are rising there, but they can afford it. They have the pillow, right?
Right.
Yeah. That was something I was thinking about, talking, because we were talking about food reform just a little bit earlier, and it would be very interesting to see how the situation will be different if local food networks were stronger and we were less dependent on convoluted global supply chains where there are catastrophic price increases with every single little incident.
Right. And I think that it is partially we're seeing the negative impacts of that because we have such an immature leader, at the helm. I've sat there and, a dear friend of mine, he works in cattle insurance. And so, but pricing insurance. And so things like if a drought was to happen or, if the president was to tweet something stupid and, it's so he works in that field, but talking to him and listening to him have to explain that his job, which is basically analyzing the profitability of Virginia farmers, but Virginia beef farmers in particular, his job is differing hour by hour based on the tweets of an 80-some-year-old man who has never set foot on a cattle farm in his life. And that in the same time, Trump is tweeting things like, cattle farmers, you should be happy. I'm the only reason you're making money anyway. What? And as a farmer,
how much money exactly?
Yeah, how much money? And when the heck did we start letting people talk to us like that? That's the thing about farmers. It's the thing about rural folks is we're supposed to have a backbone, is we're supposed to stand up for ourselves. And that's what I'm saying to people now is now's the time we have to stand up.
So, since we are migrating over to Washington in terms of discussion, there's a question I want to ask. There are two particularly striking elements to your campaign that place you apart from many other Democrats. One, of course, is that the rural life is in your bones, whereas the vast majority of rural voters almost everywhere in the United States favor Republicans. The other, which may be connected, is that virtually your entire campaign places the livelihoods of rural Virginians first, whereas other federal congressional candidates may focus more on issues such as social justice, environmental regulations, foreign policy, etc., that concern the United States as a whole. I myself am a rural voter, though not quite from around here, as you might be able to tell, who is often very intrigued by this local approach. To that end, do you think sticking to local messaging could be a good way for Democrats to bring in unexpected quantities of rural voters who are disillusioned with their voices not being heard?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and one of my favorite things to talk about. I have a mentor who he's a former Virginia delegate, but he's actually a Republican. He's an old school Republican, and I've known him for 20 some years, and he's a farmer like myself. And when I first told him I was going to run for office, and and he knew I was a Democrat, he looked at me and he said, "Thank God." And it kind of shocked me. And I said, "Why?" He said, we need rural Democrats. He said, because rural Democrats were the one people in the legislature who you always knew how they'd vote because they always voted for their people. They didn't get caught up into, ideological this or that. They couldn't be bought. Is rural Democrats really, he said, we used to call them the blue bulldogs. They used to really go in and fight for their people. And so, for me, like I said, I never wanted to be a politician. I wasn't drawn to this race because, well, I sure wasn't drawn because it was easy, right? And I wasn't drawn to it because I thought I had all the answers. But I was drawn to run, and I was asked to run for Congress because I genuinely love this district and believe that we deserve better. But what that is going to take is it's going to take someone who can say that I will work with anyone who wants to work for our people. And that means Republicans or independents or libertarians. You want to do something good for our people, then let's get to work. If you want to hurt our people, and I don't care who you are, you can't come to our district and do that. And that's including a Democrat as well. And that, I think, is the simple promise that people are asking for their representatives. And I think that is we're at a time in America where there's going to be a stark difference in people who want to be politicians and people who want to be representatives. And I'm going to tell you now, I have no interest in being a politician, but I will represent these people because I love them.
Yeah, some people certainly chase the power, and I did notice earlier on you had some quips about Northern Virginia Democrats because you think they're going to go, and because it is a data center capital of the country, right? They're going to go and bring their data centers down here. The money goes back toward them, and you guys end up with nothing, and it ends up just like coal, it's just in a technological form.
Right.
So it would be interesting in that sense to see the traditional party lines, not traditional, but the ones that we see nowadays, sort of break down with the existence of more rural Democrats. And you got to remember that West Virginia, until about the year 2008, right, was mostly Democratic. It would go consistently blue.
Yeah,
Southwest Virginia was too?
Mm-hmm,
wow.
Yep. This district was, and that's actually the history of this district is not one that flips every couple years. So, we had Congressman Wampler was before Congressman Boucher. So he was a Republican. He served for years and years. Congressman Boucher served for over 20 years and served as a Democrat. Like I had people tell me all the time, it used to be embarrassing to be a Republican in Southwest Virginia.
And the question, everyone is.
Yeah, the question is did the people leave the party or did the party leave the people? And I think it was a little bit of both. And I think there's a lesson to be learned there. Friends of Cole and Steve Bannon, they came in and they set their sights on this district. They invested in it and they flipped it in 1 year. It was not, the Democrats didn't come back and they didn't invest back and they haven't fought for it. And that's my message is, and this is where I get really frustrated with Democrats who aren't from rural areas, who speak on rural areas, because the DNC only invests 3% of their budget in communicating with rural voters. We know how much the GOP has invested in lying to our neighbors. Just think about the millions that were invested in just the redistricting campaign alone. If we are not adequately investing and telling people the truth, how do we expect them to find it? And so that's what this campaign is about. It's about raising the hard questions, not just for the Republicans, but honestly probably for some Democrats too. And I already have. We're on air, so I won't give you a list, but there's some Democrats that I've had some tense conversations just because our district deserves respect, and it doesn't matter which party you're from, you're going to respect it.
Certainly, and again, no matter what party you are from, it is always good for accountability for your fellow party members, right?
Absolutely.
You cannot just give them a pass just because they believe largely the same things you do, right?
Exactly, and that's if the Republicans did that, the country would be in a very different place right now, I think.
So you had mentioned redistricting, so that leads us right to our next question. So as you know, we had the special election just 2 days ago asking whether the General Assembly is allowed to redistrict. Now that it is passed, funnily enough, we at WUVT are not actually part of the district you represent anymore, which is so funny because, when I was preparing this talk with you, you were a potential candidate of ours, and now suddenly you are not.
Right.
All the rural Democratic heavy college towns, Harrisonburg, Charlottesville, Blacksburg, Radford, have all been lumped into the 6th District, and in return, your district received a lot of the staunchly Republican counties in the northern Allegheny Plateau, such as Botetourt, Bath, Highland, Allegheny, even parts of Augusta, so basically all the way to Stanton.
Yeah.
So given that this recent rearrangement will put the Democratic Party of Virginia at an advantage as a whole, but you and other 9th District Democrats at a significant disadvantage, and also given the greater implications of adding to the nationwide redistricting battle, do you think this was the right choice?
So, I think that a lot of the conversation has centered around fairness, which I find really interesting because I think that's a very simple discussion. Did this become fair? It became fair when Donald Trump said, "Texas, draw me 5 seats." The Republicans sat by silently and let Donald Trump put that in the political playbook. I wish they never had. In fact, in 2021, Morgan Griffith had the chance to vote against gerrymandering and make it nationally banned. Why did they leave it in the playbook? I never would have. No, I don't think that nationally this was the right thing to do. Do I think that Virginia Democrats made the right choice? From my perception, as a rural Democrat who knows my people, I do think there was another way. Was this way fair? Yes, of course it was fair because Donald Trump put it in the political playbook. We need to move on from that. But I think that what this does for me is it really, some people might look at this and they say, okay, well, this is one Republican district. No, this is one rural district. And actually it's really interesting because the Republicans framed a lot of their argument against this, that these maps were going to be about silencing rural voices. I think that they've been silencing rural voices for a long time, and that's what I aggressively plan to campaign on, is exactly what does it mean to be a rural representative. And so whether this was fair, whether it was not, I think that question lies with Donald Trump, and he never should have done what he did. But as far as this race I think that the redistricting makes it even more clear that I should be the candidate representing this district. I'm the one rural candidate on either party who actually understands and knows this district.
Yeah, that is a really thoughtful answer. Just for fun, I want to hear what an average day on the farm looks like. We never hear much about what the day-to-day lives of emerging politicians look like, and I think it would be nice for people to realize, whoa, she has to deal with all the same stuff I have to.
Yeah. So, well, first, I have a 6-year-old who I adopted from foster care, and funny story, when I adopted him, they told me he'd be with me for a maximum of 2 weeks, and he was 8 months old then, and so now he's 6 and he's with me forever. And but that means that first and foremost, my day starts as a mom, and I think a lot of people can relate to that. And so, being a single mom and getting up and making sure he gets to school. So, usually I'd never met someone who embodies that their feet hit the ground running, but that's the way my sons do. So we get up, we start the day, we do our morning checks, we do health checks around the farm, and then we get him to school by about 7:30, come back, and then I'll do farm work for about 2 hours, and then we go straight into political work. And then, the other part of this is my district is now, it was before Tuesday, it was bigger than New Jersey. I have to figure out which state we're bigger than now, but I'm sure we probably bumped up in the ranking there. But essentially I have a third of the landmass of Virginia now that I'm responsible for campaigning in. So we get to do that a lot, and him and I have been planning on fun campaigning things that we can do together. But I think balancing the farm, mom, and campaigning, it makes sure that I keep my priorities straight.
Well, for sure. That is, it sounds like an incredibly intense schedule. Not really a lot of room for free time.
Right.
Yeah. You were talking about your son, so something I have not mentioned yet, you have 3 education-related goals you would like to fulfill: affordable childcare, teacher retention, and connecting schools to employers. To some degree, these are all connected, but I would like to hear the policies you deem most important to any one of these goals.
Yeah. I think that what we've seen is we've seen a continuance kind of abandonment of education. And what happens is the federal government becomes a bad partner, the state government becomes a worse partner, and then the local governments become overburdened. And I think that, a few decades ago, a majority, like 80% of public school funding actually came from the federal government, and now it's minuscule now. And so what we have to understand is this revenue has to come from somewhere. And so while, we're not taxing our corporations, what's ended up happening is we're overburdening and kind of giving our students scraps, because that's where those cuts went. What I would like to see is I would like to kind of see us reverse that. And I know we have great programs like Teach for America and things like that, but a lot of those are centered around urban centers. I would love to see us invest, and not necessarily invest in teachers who just want to come and live somewhere for a couple years. But if we could do that with our local teachers who actually want to return and teach in the communities that they're from. And I think that's key, is how, because I talk to people every single day, whether it be people who have had to leave their home community, or whether it's, a young person trying to figure out, how they can make it work, is they want to go home. They want to live in Southwest Virginia. That's why our home plan is so important. But we have to make sure there's adequate funding and jobs there. A few other things. One of the most basic elements of education, and this is global, any education system that is of value has an incredible early education program. And we have to get our minds in America wrapped around the truth that is education is infrastructure. And so investing in Universal Head Start is going to be one of the most powerful things that we can do to shape our economy, to shape our future 10, 20, 30 years from now. Because what we're seeing is in rural communities is we don't have those same access. And if we do, it's now more expensive to send a child to daycare than it is to community college. Like set with that. So how are we, and that's, listen, I've been in that position. I've done the tours of early childhood education. You don't want to be bargain shopping for who's going to be taking care of your kid. But we're putting our parents into that position. And so I would love to see universal early childhood education. We're seeing some states tackle that, but we have to have a federal answer for that. And there's no reason why we can't if we're the best country in the world, because other countries are already doing it.
Well, yeah, it seems to be the story of so many different places in rural America. Someone grows up there, they go away to gather some skills in college or trade, and they look at it and realize there are no opportunities there. They cannot find a way to live there. The costs are just too steep, the pay is just too low, and they end up in some big city or suburb somewhere at the mercy of the large corporations that are trying to get the same place now. So,
Absolutely.
And of course, it is a problem for teachers because they are supposed to be the vital parts of the community, right? They cannot. It's not just about teaching reading, writing, or arithmetic. They actually got to understand the needs of the students around them. But also, where education ties in is, you were talking about it. That is where people really acquire the skills that you need to build up the community where it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, well, there's so much more I wish we could have touched on, Miss Powers, but unfortunately we have reached the end of our time slot. Thank you. It was an honor to speak with you, and I wish you best of luck as you continue your way down the campaign trail.
Thank you so much. It was a great day.